One wrong door. One ruthless alpha. One fated bond that could save them, or destroy them both. Hey everyone and welcome back. The story of Lyah and Vince continues now, and the stakes have never been higher. But hold on. If you're new here and have no idea what I'm talking about, stop. This is part 2 of an epic, steamy, dark romance, and you absolutely do not want to be spoiled. The link to begin the story from chapter 1 is on the screen right now. Go watch part 1 and we'll be waiting for you right here when you're done. For everyone else, you know what just happened. From a terrified captive in a gilded cage, Lyah has become a willing partner to a hunted alpha. She made her choice, to run with the wolf, not from him. But the hotel room was just the beginning. Now the real war begins. They're leaving the city behind and heading straight into the heart of the Packlands, where new dangers await. Can a human, scarred and alone, win the trust of an entire pack that sees her as a weakness? And as the traitor's shadow looms and a rival alpha closes in for the kill, will their fated bond be their salvation, or their downfall? The hunt is on. Let's dive into chapter 21. The cab of the truck became their new world, a moving sanctuary of leather, steel and the steady, reassuring rumble of the engine. The intimacy of the cabin, born of desperation and discovery, traveled with them. Vince's hand remained linked with hers, a constant grounding pressure on his thigh. It was no longer the grip of a captor, but the anchor of a partner, a silent promise in the unfolding darkness. They drove through the pre-dawn hours, leaving the anonymous highways behind for a network of winding country roads that seemed to draw them deeper into the heart of the land. Lyah watched the landscape change. The flat, cultivated fields gave way to rolling hills and then to the dark, imposing silhouettes of ancient forests. It felt like they were driving off the edge of the map into a world that was older and wilder. With the immediate threat of the city behind them, the atmosphere in the truck shifted. The sharp, adrenalized tension of their escape softened into a deep, humming awareness. Now that the claiming was complete, Lyah felt a new connection to him, a current of energy that flowed through their joined hands. It was more than just physical touch. She could feel the steady, thrumming power of the alpha in him, the quiet grief for his friend that still lingered like a shadow, and beneath it all, a fierce, unwavering protectiveness directed entirely at her. It was a language without words and she was beginning instinctively to understand it. "The marking," she said softly, breaking the comfortable silence. "I can feel you. More than before." Vince glanced at her, his golden eyes catching the faint green glow of the dashboard. A faint, proud smile touched his lips. "The bond is complete now. It's a two-way connection. You'll feel my emotions, my intent, and I yours. It will grow stronger over time." He squeezed her hand. "It means I will never be able to lie to you. And you will always know if I am in danger." The last part sent a chill through her that had nothing to do with the early morning air. The idea of feeling his pain, his death from miles away was a terrifying thought. It was a bond with a blade's edge. "It also means you are now tied to my land," he continued, his voice taking on a deeper, more resonant tone. "We're getting close. You should start to feel it soon. The edge of my territory." "Feel what?" she asked, looking out at the dense, dark woods that pressed in on the road. "Home," he said simply. She almost scoffed. The concept of home was a fractured, painful thing for her. It was a place you ran from, not toward. But as the miles wore on, she began to notice a subtle shift, not in the landscape but in the very air itself. It was a change in pressure, a thrumming energy that seemed to rise from the earth and seep into the truck. It resonated with the new humming connection she felt with Vince. The air here felt cleaner, charged with a primal energy that made the hairs on her arms stand up. It didn't feel threatening. It felt welcoming. It felt like his scent, magnified 1,000 times over. Pine, earth and raw, untamed power. They stopped once at a small, darkened gas station in a town that was little more than a crossroads. Vince got out to fill the tank, his movements economical and alert, his gaze sweeping their surroundings constantly. Lyah watched him through the windshield, a solitary, powerful figure under the buzzing fluorescent lights. He was a king in exile moving through a world that didn't know he existed. A wave of fierce possessiveness, an emotion so unfamiliar she barely recognized it, washed over her. It was a reflection of what she felt from him through the bond. When he slid back into the driver's seat, he brought the crisp, cool scent of the night air with him. He looked at her, his gaze intense, and she knew he had felt it too, her sudden flare of emotion. He leaned across the console and gave her a hard, brief kiss that was full of unspoken promises. Soon, he murmured against her lips before pulling away and putting the truck back in gear. He was no longer just driving toward a war. He was bringing his queen home. Chapter 22, The Scent of Home. The sun was a pale, watery disk on the horizon when Vince finally turned the truck onto a narrow, unmarked gravel road. The dense forest canopy closed in overhead, creating a tunnel of green and shadow. The thrumming energy Lyah had been feeling intensified, becoming a tangible presence that vibrated in her bones. It was a low, powerful hum like a sleeping giant's breath. "We're on Packlands now," Vince said, his voice imbued with a quiet pride. He seemed to relax in a way she hadn't seen before, the harsh lines of his face softening as he breathed in the air of his home. The heart of the territory, the town of Silverwood, is another 20 miles in. The safe house where Kale will meet us is on the outer edge, here in the mountains. Lyah looked out the window, mesmerized. This was his kingdom. It was a world away from the concrete and steel she was used to. Sunlight speared through the thick leaves, dappling the forest floor. The air that drifted through the open window was rich with the scent of damp earth, decaying leaves and the sharp, clean fragrance of pine. It was the scent of life, raw and unfiltered. And woven through it all like a foundational chord in a symphony, was the scent of him. He finally understood. The territory was an extension of the Alpha. "It feels," she struggled for the word, "alive." "It is," he affirmed. "The bond between an Alpha and his packlands is symbiotic. I protect it and it sustains us. Every shifter in my pack feels this. It's what connects us. It's what Liam betrayed." The mention of the traitor's name brought the grim reality of their situation crashing back. This beautiful, vibrant land was under threat from within. The peace she felt was a fragile thing, the calm before a coming storm. Vince drove them to a high ridge overlooking a vast, wooded valley. He parked the truck at a scenic overlook, the view stretching for miles. In the distance, a river snaked like a silver ribbon through the trees. He cut the engine and they sat in silence, the only sound the whisper of the wind through the pines. "This is your home now, Lyah," he said softly, his gaze fixed on the valley below. "Everything you see I will protect for you. For us." She turned to look at him, her heart swelling with an emotion so powerful it almost hurt. The fierce, possessive Alpha was still there, but his claim was no longer just about her body or their bond. It was about her future, her safety, her place in the world. He wasn't just offering her a space in his life, he was offering her a kingdom. He finally turned from the view to look at her, his golden eyes searching her face. "Are you afraid?" She considered the question honestly. The thought of the coming fight, of Marcus Thorne and the traitor Liam, sent a tremor of fear through her. But standing here, on this land that felt so intrinsically linked to the man beside her, the fear was a distant thing. It was overshadowed by a powerful, burgeoning sense of belonging. The woman who had spent her life running, who believed she belonged nowhere, was finally home. "No," she answered, and she was surprised by the conviction in her own voice. "I'm not. Not with you." The relief and pride that flooded his expression was her reward. He reached out, his hand gently cupping her jaw, his thumb stroking her scar. This time there was no memory of past pain, only the warmth of his touch. He didn't kiss her. He simply held her gaze, a silent communion passing between them on the current of their bond. In his eyes she saw not the reflection of a scarred, broken woman, but the image of his Luna, his mate, the queen of this vast, wild and beautiful land. It was a role she had never asked for, but one that her soul was, with every passing moment, beginning to claim as its own. Chapter 23, The Beta's Gaze. The rendezvous point was a remote, weather-beaten cabin that stood in a small clearing a few miles from the overlook. It was more of a functional outpost than a home, built of dark, sturdy logs with narrow windows that looked more like defensive slits. As Vince pulled the truck to a stop, a man emerged from the shadows of the porch. He was tall and broad, built with the solid, immovable strength of a mountain oak. His hair was a salt and pepper gray, cropped short, and his face was a roadmap of hard-lived years, dominated by a formidable jaw and a nose that had clearly been broken more than once. His eyes, a cool, intelligent gray, missed nothing. This was Kale. Vince got out of the truck, and the two men clasped forearms, a warrior's greeting steeped in history and respect. "Alpha," Cale said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. His gaze was fixed on Vince, but Lyah felt the weight of his peripheral awareness, a professional assessing scrutiny. Cale, Vince replied. Any news? The outpost is quiet. He's there. Arrogant. Thinks you're still 100 miles away running scared. Cale's gaze finally shifted, moving from Vince to the passenger side of the truck where Lyah sat, her heart beginning to pound. This was her first test, her first encounter with Vince's world. Vince walked around and opened her door, his presence a solid, protective shield. He offered her his hand and she took it, sliding out of the truck to stand beside him. She felt small and fragile next to these two formidable men. Cale's gaze swept over her. It wasn't hostile or lewd, but it was intensely analytical. He took in her human fragility, her worn clothes, her scarred face, and then his eyes locked on the faint, shimmering mark on her neck. His expression, which had been a mask of grim professionalism, flickered with surprise, then a dawning understanding and finally a profound, solemn respect. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible bow of his head. Luna, he acknowledged, the single word a quiet pledge of loyalty. The formal title startled Lyah. Vince's hand tightened on hers. This is Lyah, Vince said, his voice leaving no room for argument. Her safety is now your only priority. No one gets to her. Not Thorne, not Liam's loyalists, not anyone. If this keep is compromised, you take her to the secondary location. You protect her with your life. I understand, Alpha, Cale said, his gaze unwavering. The moment Lyah had been dreading was here. Separation. Vince turned to her, and the Alpha's mask was gone, replaced by the raw emotion of the man, his mate. He pulled her into his arms, his embrace fierce and tight, burying his face in her hair and inhaling her scent as if to memorize it, to carry it with him into battle. This is the hardest thing I've ever done, he murmured into her ear, his voice a low, pained growl. The bond between them throbbed with his anguish at their impending separation. It felt like a physical tearing. Be careful, she whispered into his chest, her hands fisting in his shirt. He pulled back, his hands framing her face. I'm going to end this. I'm going to gut the man who betrayed me and destroy the one who threatens my pack. And then I am coming back for you, he vowed, his eyes blazing with a golden fire. He crushed his mouth to hers in a hard, possessive kiss. It wasn't a kiss of passion but of branding. It was a promise, a vow, and a final, desperate taste. It was over too quickly. He released her, his eyes lingering on her for one last, agonizing second. Then, without another word, he turned, got back into the truck and was gone, the black vehicle disappearing down the gravel track, leaving a cloud of dust in its wake. Lyah stood frozen, the ache of his absence a physical void in her chest. The bond stretched thin and taut between them, a painful, invisible tether. She was alone in a strange place with a man she didn't know, watching the only safety she had ever known drive away into a war. Chapter 24. The Mountains Keep. The silence left by the truck's departure was heavy and absolute. Lyah stood on the dusty ground, her gaze fixed on the spot where Vince had disappeared, feeling the invisible tether of their bond stretch until it was a thin, humming wire of pure anxiety. The warmth of his presence had been stripped away, leaving her feeling cold and exposed despite the mild afternoon air. This way, Luna. Cale's voice, respectful but firm, broke through her daze. She turned to look at him. His expression was impassive, but his gray eyes held a flicker of understanding. He had seen the raw pain of their separation. He led her inside the keep. The interior was as stark and functional as the outside. It was a fortress, not a home. The main room was dominated by a large stone fireplace and a heavy wooden table. The furniture was simple, built for durability, not comfort. There were maps on the walls and a rack of serious-looking weaponry stood by the door. It was a place designed for warriors, a place to wait for a war. The perimeter wards are active, Cale explained, his voice echoing slightly in the Spartan room. Nothing gets within a mile of this cabin without me knowing about it. You are safe here. Safe. The word felt like a lie. Her safety was driving into a traitor's den. She wrapped her arms around herself, a familiar, defensive posture. Cale motioned to a chair at the table. Please. He retrieved 2 mugs and a thermos from a counter, pouring a dark, steaming liquid that smelled of herbs and pine. He placed one in front of her. This will help with the separation. She looked at him surprised. You can tell. It's a physical pain for an alpha to leave his claimed mate, especially for the first time, Cale said, taking a seat across from her. The bond is new and the wolf sees it as an unnatural act. It will be tearing at him. And what he feels you will feel echoes of. His simple, direct explanation was a strange comfort. He wasn't treating her like a fragile human, but like someone who needed to understand the mechanics of this new world. She took a sip of the tea. It was bitter but warming, and it did seem to soothe the frantic edges of her anxiety. You were his beta before? She asked, needing to fill the silence, to understand the man Vince had entrusted with her life. Cale nodded. For a time. Before Evan, the beta who was killed in the ambush. He stared into his mug. Liam, Vince and I, we were pups together. We learned to fight, to hunt, to lead. I never thought, he trailed off, the pain of the betrayal evident even on his stoic face. The pack is shaken. To have our beta ambushed is one thing. To learn the snake who planned it was one of our own, a respected elder, it has poisoned morale. His words painted a grim picture. Vince wasn't just fighting an external enemy, he was fighting to heal the soul of his own pack. He'll fix it, Lyah said, the words coming out with a certainty that surprised even herself. He'll make it right. Cale looked up at her, his gaze sharp and assessing once more. He studied her for a long moment, taking in the quiet conviction in her eyes. He had likely expected a terrified human, a weakness his alpha had acquired. But he was seeing something else. He is a great alpha, Cale finally agreed, a note of renewed conviction in his own voice. The greatest I have known. But no alpha is invincible. This bond, it makes him stronger, but it is also a vulnerability Thorne will not hesitate to exploit. That is why your safety is paramount. You are not just his mate, Luna. You are the future of this pack. The weight of his words settled on her. It wasn't just a title of affection from Vince. It was a position, a responsibility. The safety of this pack, this wild and beautiful land, was now tied to her own. As she sat in the silent, formidable keep, the ache of Vince's absence sharp in her chest, Lyah realized the true stakes of this war. She wasn't just waiting for her mate to come home. She was a queen in hiding, waiting for her king to secure their kingdom. Chapter 25. The Ghost in the North. Vince drove with a cold, focused fury. The pain of leaving Lyah was a physical clawing in his gut, a frantic howling from his wolf that demanded he turn back. He suppressed it with brutal efficiency, channeling the agony into a diamond-hard point of rage directed at one man, Liam. The further he drove from Lyah, the more the soothing balm of her presence faded, and the old, familiar storm began to gather inside him. But it was different now. Before, his rage was a wild, chaotic thing he constantly fought to contain. Now it had a purpose, a target. Lyah was his anchor, and even from miles away, her presence in his soul kept his fury from consuming his reason. It was no longer a wildfire. It was a blast furnace ready to be aimed. He left the truck hidden in a deep ancient grove miles from the outpost and continued on foot. Here in the northern woods he had once patrolled with the boy who became the traitor, he let the wolf rise closer to the surface. His senses expanded, the world exploding into a dizzying array of information. He could smell the day-old trail of a buck, hear the frantic heartbeat of a field mouse 100 yards away, and feel the subtle vibrations of the earth through the soles of his boots. The air around the outpost was wrong. It smelled of his pack, yes, but it was tainted. Underneath the familiar scents of wood smoke and pine, there was a foreign, bitter tang. Marcus Thorne's jackals had been here. The scent was faint, days old, but it was an undeniable desecration. They had been welcomed, entertained. He moved through the trees like a ghost, a silent shadow flitting between the massive trunks of oaks and pines. He circled the outpost, a small settlement of log cabins and a central longhouse, built to guard the northern border. He saw Liam's men, the guards he had handpicked. They looked lax, their postures too relaxed for a pack on high alert. They believed the lie. They believed their alpha was gone, that the war was distant. Vince's lip curled in a silent snarl. Liam hadn't just betrayed him. He had betrayed the men under his command, leaving them fat and lazy, ripe for slaughter by Thorne when the time came. He waited for nightfall, the last vestiges of daylight bleeding from the sky. He watched as Liam emerged from the largest cabin, his personal dwelling. Liam looked the same, tall with sandy hair and an easy smile he used to charm everyone. But to Vince's heightened senses, his scent was soured with deceit. He saw Liam share a laugh with one of the guards, clapping him on the back. The casual, friendly gesture was so profoundly treacherous it made Vince's blood run cold. Later, from his vantage point in the deep shadows of the forest's edge, Vince watched a single light burn in Liam's cabin. The rest of the outpost slept, wrapped in a blanket of false security. This was it. The time for answers. The time for a reckoning. He didn't enter through the door. He moved to the back of the cabin, placing his hands on the solid log wall. He closed his eyes, focusing, calling on the raw, primal strength of the wolf. With a low growl that was more felt than heard, he exerted pressure. Wood groaned, fibers splintered, and a section of the back wall simply gave way, shoved inward with explosive, controlled force. Vince stepped through the splintered opening into the dim, firelit room. Liam was sitting at a table, a bottle of whiskey before him, a map spread out under his hands. He leaped to his feet at the sound of the intrusion, his chair crashing backward, his hand flying to the hilt of a knife at his belt. His eyes were wide, first with shock, then with a dawning, absolute terror as he recognized the figure stepping out of the shadows. The ghost he thought was 100 miles away. "Vince," he choked out, his face pale as bone. Vince didn't speak. He just let his eyes bleed from their normal hazel gold to the pure, burning molten gold of the unrestrained alpha. He took a slow, deliberate step forward, the embodiment of a lifetime of betrayed loyalty and a promise of imminent, brutal death. The hunt was over. The judgment was about to begin. Chapter 26. The Traitor's Confession. The air in the cabin was thick with the metallic scent of Liam's terror. He stood frozen, his hand hovering over the knife at his belt, a useless gesture against the force of nature that had just breached his walls. Vince didn't move, didn't speak. He let the silence and his own burning golden gaze do the work for him. He watched the sweat bead on Liam's brow, watched his old friend's mind race and find no escape. "You're supposed to be," Liam stammered, his bravado crumbling into dust. "Hiding." Vince finished for him, his voice a low, gravelly sound that was more wolf than man. "Running? That's the alpha you remember, is it, Liam? A coward." He took another slow step forward and Liam flinched back, his hand dropping from his knife. There was no fight in him. There was only the dawning, sickening realization that his betrayal had failed. "I needed information, old friend," Vince continued, his voice deceptively calm. "And you were the last person I ever would have suspected. A masterful stroke of treachery. You must be very proud." The sarcasm was a physical blow. Liam's face, already pale, turned ashen. "Vince, I can explain. Thorne, he has things, resources. He promised you a throne you could never win on your own," Vince snarled, the alpha's fury finally breaking through the surface. In a blur of motion, he crossed the room and slammed Liam back against the wall, his forearm pressed hard against the traitor's throat. The map on the table fluttered from the force of the impact. "He promised you my pack, my title, my land. And you, a brother to me, were willing to trade the lives of our people for it." Liam choked, his eyes bulging, his hands scrabbling uselessly at Vince's arm. "He forced me, he had leverage." "Lies," Vince growled, pressing harder, lifting Liam slightly off his feet. The wolf was roaring in his chest, demanding blood, demanding he rip the throat out of this snake. But Vince held it back. He needed answers more than vengeance. "For now. You will tell me everything. No. Thorne's numbers. His positions. The full details of the trap he has waiting for me at the main pass. Every single detail." Terror gave Liam a desperate clarity. Choking, his face turning purple, he began to talk. The words tumbled out in a frantic, broken stream. He confessed everything. Thorne had a force twice the size of what Vince's scouts had reported, bolstered by rogue shifters and mercenaries. They were planning to let Vince's vanguard enter the narrowest part of the mountain pass, then use explosives to seal both ends, trapping them. Liam's role was to lead a second force from the north, hitting the main settlement at Silverwood while Vince was pinned down, sowing chaos and slaughtering the families left behind. It was a pincer movement designed not just to kill Vince, but to shatter the heart of his pack completely. As Vince listened, his rage cooled, solidifying into something far more dangerous. Cold, absolute certainty. He absorbed every detail, every troop movement, every whispered promise Thorne had made. The sheer, calculated evil of the plan, and the intimate role his oldest friend had played in it, was breathtaking. When Liam was finished, his confession hanging in the air like a death sentence, he looked at Vince with pleading eyes. "I had to, Vince. Please, for what we were." Vince stared into the eyes of the man he had once called brother. He saw nothing there he recognized. Only weakness, greed, and a profound, unforgivable treachery. He loosened his grip slightly, letting Liam slump to the floor, gasping for air. "What we were is dead," Vince said, his voice devoid of all emotion. "You burned it to the ground the moment you sided with him." He turned his back on the pathetic, weeping man on the floor. The information was secured. The plan was revealed. Now all that was left was the judgment. Chapter 27. The Alpha's Judgment. Vince didn't kill Liam in the cabin. That would have been a private vengeance, a quiet murder. What Liam had done was a public crime, a betrayal against the entire pack, and it demanded a public sentence. He hauled Liam from the cabin and into the pre-dawn chill of the outpost's common ground. He slammed his fist against the heavy iron bell that served as an alarm, the harsh, clanging notes shattering the morning quiet. Lights flickered on in the surrounding cabins. Men and women, warriors of the Northern Guard, stumbled out, bleary-eyed and confused, their hands on their weapons. Their confusion turned to stunned disbelief as they saw the scene in the center of the compound. Liam, their respected commander, was on his knees, held in the iron grip of their alpha, who stood over him like a vengeful god, his eyes burning with a golden light. The raw, unrestrained power rolling off Vince was a physical force that brought the entire outpost to a standstill. "Your commander, Liam, has betrayed us." Vince's voice boomed across the compound, an alpha's command that compelled utter attention. "He made a deal with Marcus Thorne. He fed Thorne our patrol schedules, our weaknesses. He planned the ambush that killed your beta, Evan, and his enforcers. And he conspired to lead you, his own guard, into a slaughter while Thorne's jackals burned your homes and murdered your families." A collective gasp and murmurs of shock and outrage rippled through the assembled shifters. They looked from their stoic, furious alpha to the trembling, defeated man on the ground. The truth was undeniable. It was in Liam's terrified scent, in the raw authority of Vince's presence. "Is this true?" One of the senior guards, a grizzled warrior named Ulrich, demanded, his gaze fixed on Liam. Liam couldn't speak. He could only sob, a pathetic, broken sound. "By the old laws," Vince declared, his voice ringing with ancient authority, "the penalty for such treason is death. The traitor's blood must be used to cleanse the land he has poisoned." He drew the heavy hunting knife from his belt, its polished steel gleaming in the first light of dawn. He didn't look at Liam. He looked at the assembled pack members, his gaze sweeping over each and every one of them, reasserting his dominance, his right to rule, his duty to protect. He turned back to Liam, who looked up at him one last time, his eyes full of a lifetime of shared memories now curdled into a final, desperate plea. Vince's expression was granite. There was no mercy there. Only justice. With a single, swift, and brutal motion, he ended the life of the man who had been his brother. The act was savage, primal, and absolutely necessary. It was a cauterizing of a festering wound. A wave of shock, then grim understanding, passed through the crowd. They had been lied to, endangered, their loyalty used as a weapon against their own kind. Vince stood over the body, the knife still in his hand. "This is the fate of all traitors," he said, his voice low but carrying to every corner of the compound. "Marcus Thorne believes we are broken. He believes we are leaderless. He's wrong. Today we remind him what it means to provoke the wolves of Silverwood." He looked at Ulrich. "Gather your best warriors. We ride in 1 hour. The rest of you will fortify this outpost. A war is coming to our front door and we will meet it with fire and steel." A single powerful howl rose from Ulrich's throat, a sound of mourning, of fury, and of renewed absolute loyalty. It was answered by another and another, until the entire outpost was a chorus of howling wolves, their voices echoing off the mountains. The poison had been purged. The pack, scarred but unified, was ready for war. Chapter 28. Whispers on the Bond. Miles away, in the silent, formidable keep, Lyah woke with a gasp, her body drenched in a cold sweat. Her heart hammered against her ribs, and a wave of icy, murderous rage that was not her own washed through her. It was so powerful, so absolute, it left her breathless. She felt the grim satisfaction of a blade finding its mark, the heavy finality of a life ending, and a profound soul-deep sorrow that followed in its wake. She stumbled out of her small bedroom and into the main room of the keep. Cale was already awake, standing by the cold hearth, his expression grim. He looked at her and his gray eyes were full of a quiet, knowing pity. "Vince," she breathed, her hand going to her chest as if to calm the storm of foreign emotions raging within her. "Something's happened. The Alpha has administered justice," Cale said, his voice a low rumble. "The traitor has been dealt with." Lyah stared at him, horrified and amazed. She hadn't heard a sound, received no call, yet she knew deep in her bones that he was right. He had felt it. She had been a distant passenger to Vince's judgment, the echoes of his actions vibrating along the invisible thread of their bond. The cold fury, the sorrow, the brutal necessity of the act. It was all there, a phantom limb of his own experience. "I felt it," she whispered, sinking into a chair at the heavy table. "I felt him." "The bond is strongest when an alpha's emotions are at their peak," Cale explained, his voice gentle. He came and sat across from her, his presence a steady, grounding force against the turbulent emotions she was experiencing. Rage, grief, arousal, acclaiming, a kill. You will feel them all. It is the blessing and the curse of being a Luna. A curse. That's what it felt like right now. The emotional backlash was dizzying, leaving her feeling weak and raw. It was one thing to be told about this world, and another to have its primal, violent realities transmitted directly into her soul. She felt Vince's pain for his fallen friend as keenly as she felt his cold resolve. The contradiction was tearing her apart. "Does he feel me?" she asked, a tremor in her voice. "Every beat of your heart," Cale affirmed. "Your fear now is a distraction he cannot afford, but your strength will be a fortress for him. He will draw on it." His words struck her with the force of a revelation. He was not just a passive receiver. She was an anchor. Her emotional state had a direct impact on him, on his ability to lead, to fight. The realization was a heavy weight, but it was also a call to action. She couldn't afford to be a terrified, trembling victim. He needed her to be strong. She took a deep, shuddering breath, consciously pushing back against the waves of his emotions, trying to find her own center in the storm. She focused on the solid wood of the table beneath her hands, the scent of the pine tea Cale had made her, the quiet strength emanating from the man sitting across from her. "Tell me about the old laws," she said, her voice steadier now. "Tell me about the laws he just invoked." Cale looked at her, a flicker of deep respect in his eyes. She wasn't succumbing to the emotional chaos. She was seeking to understand it, to arm herself with knowledge. He had been tasked with protecting the Alpha's mate, this fragile human. But he was beginning to understand Vince's choice. This woman had a spine of pure steel. He began to speak, his voice a low, steady murmur, explaining the ancient codes of pack justice, of honor and blood oaths. And as Lyah listened, she felt the turmoil inside her begin to settle. She was no longer just a spectator to Vince's war. Through the whispers on the bond, she had become a participant, a silent partner in his grim duties. He was the sword and the shield of the pack, and she was beginning to realize, was its heart. And a queen's heart could not afford to break. Chapter 29. A Queen in the Keep. The days that followed the traitor's execution were a lesson in patience and control. The violent emotional echoes faded, leaving behind a constant low thrum on the bond. A hum of Vince's focus, his determination, and his deep, unwavering awareness of her. It was a constant companion. A reminder that though they were separated by miles of wilderness, they were never truly apart. Lyah, however, refused to be a passive participant, a damsel waiting in a fortress. She had a role to play and she intended to learn it. Her education began with Cale. The stoic, formidable warrior became her reluctant tutor. "If I am to be the Luna of this pack," she stated one morning, her tone leaving no room for argument, "I cannot be ignorant. I need to know everything." And so Cale taught her. Poring over the detailed maps on the wall, he showed her the territory's borders, the sacred places, the patrol routes, and the areas of strategic importance. He explained the pack's hierarchy, not just the alpha and beta but the lead enforcers, the den mothers who oversaw the community, the elders who were the keepers of their history and laws. He spoke of their traditions, the seasonal hunts, the rites of passage for young shifters. Lyah absorbed it all, her mind sharp and inquisitive. She was a quick study, her questions insightful. She wasn't just learning facts, she was trying to understand the soul of the people she was now bound to. She learned the names of the families Liam had endangered, the number of children in the settlement at Silverwood. These weren't abstract concepts to her. They were Vince's people and therefore they were hers. A quiet, profound respect grew between the scarred human and the grizzled wolf. Cale began to see past the fragility and the mark on her neck. He saw a keen intelligence, a deep well of empathy and an unshakable resolve. He saw a leader. He began to offer information freely, answering questions she hadn't yet thought to ask. One afternoon as they sat at the table cleaning weapons, a task Lyah had insisted on learning, she asked the question that had been hovering at the edge of her mind. Marcus Thorne. What does he want? Why is he so determined to destroy Vince? Cale paused, the oiled rag in his hand stilling over the barrel of a rifle. Thorne is an alpha of a different sort. His pack is a loose collection of rogues, mercenaries and shifters he has broken to his will. He rules through fear, not loyalty. He sees Vince's pack, our family bonds, our traditions, our prosperity, and he covets it. He doesn't want to build something, he wants to take what is already built. Cale's expression darkened. And there's old blood between them. Thorne's father challenged Vince's father for the Alpha title years ago. He lost. It was a fair challenge, but Thorne has always seen it as a slight, a theft of his birthright. He sees Vince not just as a rival, but as the symbol of his family's humiliation. It was a story of ego, of greed, of a festering generational hatred. Lyah now understood the enemy was not just ambitious, but deeply personal and vindictive. As the days turned into a week, Lyah felt a change within herself. The fear that had been her constant companion for years was receding, replaced by a sense of purpose. Her scar, the brand of her victimhood, felt less like a mark of shame and more like a reminder of survival. She was a survivor. And she would survive this too. She was no longer just waiting for Vince. She was preparing for him. When he returned from his war, he would not find a frightened human hiding in his keep. He would find his Luna. He would find a queen, ready to stand by his side and help him rule the kingdom he was fighting to save. The keep was no longer her prison. It was her classroom, her training ground. And she was determined to be ready. Chapter 30: Thorne's Move. Marcus Thorne paced his makeshift war room, the lavish master suite of a seized countryside estate, like a caged jackal. His victory had seemed so certain. The plan was perfect, elegant in its brutality. Liam, the pathetic, ambitious fool, had delivered everything he'd promised. The trap at the mountain pass was set. The raiding party was poised to descend on the vulnerable heart of Silverwood. But the trap had never been sprung. Vince hadn't come. For days there had been only silence from the north. Liam was unreachable. The entire outpost had gone dark. Thorne wasn't a fool. He knew what that silence meant. Vince had somehow sniffed out the traitor. The element of surprise was gone. He's hiding, Thorne snarled to his second-in-command, a wiry, vicious shifter named Jax. The coward is holed up somewhere waiting for me to make a mistake. Or he's consolidating his forces, Jax offered, his scarred face impassive. Rallying the northern guard. Let him, Thorne sneered, a cruel smile twisting his lips. His pack is poisoned with doubt. Even if he killed Liam, the trust is broken. He's ruling a fractured kingdom. Thorne stopped his pacing and stared at a map of Vince's territory. His finger traced the highways leading away from the city where Vince had last been seen. He didn't run straight home, Thorne mused, his mind working. If he suspected a traitor, he wouldn't go to the one place the traitor would expect him. He went somewhere else first. To ground. To think. His eyes narrowed. And he wasn't alone in that hotel. My sources confirmed a second guest. No name, no reservation. A ghost. He was hiding someone. Thorne thrived on finding and exploiting weakness. He had thought Vince's weakness was his sentimentality for his pack. But what if it was something, or someone, more specific? A secret lover? A bargaining chip? Find his trail leading from the city, Thorne commanded Jax. I don't want a pack of brutes crashing through the woods. I want your best trackers. The quietest, most patient hunters we have. I want them to find where he went before he went north. He took something with him. Secret. And secrets are levers. Find me his lever. Within hours, a small elite team of trackers was dispatched. They were not the typical shock troops Thorne favored. They were lean, silent predators, shifters who were more wolf than man, whose senses were preternaturally sharp. They didn't begin their search on pack lands. They began at the last place Vince was seen, casting a wide, patient net. They found the trail within a day. The scent of the anonymous black truck, the faint, lingering smell of Vince's potent alpha presence. But there was something else mixed with it, a scent that intrigued and baffled them. It was human, but it was different. It was marked, overlaid with the alpha's possessive claim. It smelled of lavender and rain and a courage that had been forged in fire. The trackers followed the scent trail away from the city, not toward the main territory but east toward the rugged, isolated mountains on the outer edge of Vince's land. They moved with silent, deadly efficiency, a creeping tide of danger flowing toward the hidden keep. Marcus Thorne didn't know who or what he was hunting. He just knew that Vince, the great and powerful alpha of Silverwood, had gone to extraordinary lengths to hide something. And anything that important to his enemy was something Thorne would take great pleasure in destroying. The hunt was on. Of course. Here are the next 5 chapters, continuing the story's rising action. Chapter 31. The Whisper of Danger. Lyah was outside, standing on the narrow porch of the keep, breathing in the crisp mountain air. A week of Cale's tutelage and the steady, distant thrum of Vince's presence on the bond had settled her nerves. The constant, low-grade anxiety she had lived with for years was gone, replaced by a quiet, focused resolve. She finally felt strong. It was then that she felt the first flicker of wrongness. It wasn't a loud alarm or a jolt of panic. It was a subtle shift in the atmosphere, a discordant note in the symphony of the forest. The bird song in the surrounding trees seemed to quiet all at once. The gentle whisper of the wind through the pines took on a watchful, waiting quality. The hum of the territory, the feeling of home she had grown accustomed to, was still there, but it was now laced with a thin, sharp thread of alarm. She looked to Cale, who was splitting firewood near the edge of the clearing, his axe rising and falling with a steady, rhythmic cadence. He stopped mid-swing, his head lifting, his nostrils flaring as he scented the air. He turned his head slowly, his gaze sweeping the dense, impenetrable line of trees that surrounded the keep. "What is it?" Lyah asked, her voice low. Cale didn't answer immediately. He set the axe down with a quiet thud and walked toward her, his movements fluid and silent, the powerful warrior replacing the rustic woodsman in an instant. "Go inside," he said, his voice a low command. "Lock the door." "Cale, what did you smell?" she pressed, her heart beginning to hammer against her ribs. "Strangers," he said, his gray eyes hard as flint. "Shifters. Not of our pack. They're still miles out downwind. But they're moving slowly. Carefully. They're hunting." The words sent a spike of pure ice through her veins. Trackers. Thorne's men. They had found the trail. Lyah didn't argue. She backed into the cabin, her gaze locked on Cale. He retrieved a high-powered rifle from the rack by the door and checked the magazine with an efficient, practiced motion. "The wards will have alerted the alpha," Cale said, his voice a grim reassurance. "He will know we have company. But he is a day's ride away. It will be on us to hold them off." He looked at her, his expression serious. "Stay away from the windows. The walls are reinforced logs. You'll be safest in the back room." Lyah's mind reeled. This was it. The war wasn't a distant thing anymore. It was here, creeping through the woods toward her. The old, familiar terror, the instinct to run and hide, flared within her. She felt a phantom throb in the scar on her face, a memory of her own helplessness. But then she felt something else. A hot, fierce surge of anger. They were invading her home. They were threatening her pack. They were hunting her mate. Through the bond she felt a sudden, sharp jolt from Vince. A spike of pure, murderous rage followed by a wave of white-hot fear. But the fear wasn't his own. It was a reflection of hers, amplified and sent back to him. "He knows," she realized. "He feels my terror." Cale's words from days before echoed in her mind. "Your fear now is a distraction he cannot afford, but your strength will be a fortress for him." Clenching her fists, Lyah took a deep, shuddering breath and fought to control the panic. She consciously reached for the calm, steady center she had been building within herself. She focused on the feeling of the bond, and instead of projecting her fear, she pushed back a wave of her own fierce, defiant anger. She sent him a silent, desperate message. I am not afraid. I am with you. End this and come home. She didn't know if he could understand the words, but she knew he would feel the intent. The terrified human was gone. The Luna of Silverwood was here, and she would not be the weakness that brought down her king. Chapter 32, The Siege Begins. Cale moved with the deadly calm of a seasoned warrior. He barred the heavy wooden door, slid thick steel shutters over the narrow windows, and plunged the keep into a dim, fortress-like twilight. The only light came from the low embers in the hearth and a single, battery-powered lantern he placed on the table. How many? Lyah asked, her voice steady despite the frantic beating of her heart. 3, maybe 4, Cale replied, checking the action on a second rifle. He slid it across the table toward her. Do you know how to use one of these? Lyah stared at the weapon. It was a thing of cold, hard lethality. No. Good, Cale said to her surprise. Your job is not to fight. Your job is to stay alive. Go to the bedroom. Bar the door from the inside. There is a trapdoor under the rug that leads to a root cellar. It has a reinforced door and a tunnel that exits 100 yards into the woods. If they breach these walls, you go there. Do not hesitate. Do not wait for me. Am I understood? She nodded, her throat tight. He was preparing for the worst. He was preparing to die for her. Cale. It is my honor, Luna, he said simply, cutting her off. He gave her a grim, reassuring nod. Now go. Lyah retreated to the bedroom, the heavy rifle feeling alien and clumsy in her hands. She did as he instructed, sliding a thick iron bolt across the bedroom door. Her hands trembled as she rolled back the heavy bearskin rug, revealing the thick iron-ringed trapdoor Cale had described. This was her final escape. Her last resort. The keep fell silent. All Lyah could hear was the frantic pounding of her own blood in her ears and the distant, thrumming anxiety she felt from Vince on the bond. The waiting was a unique form of torture. Every creak of the cabin's logs, every rustle of wind, sounded like an approaching footstep. Hours passed. The dim light in the keep faded as the sun set, plunging the world outside into darkness. Lyah sat on the floor, her back against the bed, the rifle across her lap, listening. The first attack came without warning. There was no shout, no crash. Just a sudden, sharp thwack against one of the window shutters, followed by the splintering of wood. A crossbow bolt. They were testing the defenses. From the other room she heard Cale move, his boots silent on the floorboards. Another thwack hit the front door. They were circling, probing for a weakness. The silence stretched again, taut and terrible. Lyah held her breath, straining to hear. Then came the sound of something heavy scraping against the outside wall. They were trying to climb to get to the roof. A low growl rumbled from the main room. Cale. A second later, the cabin shook with the deafening roar of his rifle. He fired once, a single, controlled shot. It was answered by a choked cry of pain from outside, and the sound of a body tumbling from the roof and hitting the ground with a heavy, final thud. One down. A furious snarl echoed from the darkness outside, and then the assault began in earnest. Heavy bodies slammed against the door, the thick wood groaning in protest. Crossbow bolts hammered against the shutters. Cale answered with measured, disciplined shots, firing through specially designed slits in the walls. He wasn't spraying bullets wildly. Each shot was aimed, deliberate. Lyah could hear him moving, a ghost in the main room, firing from one position then another. He was making himself seem like more than one man. But she knew he was alone. The bond with Vince was a roaring torrent now, a tidal wave of pure, unrestrained fury and agonizing helplessness. He was too far away. He knew she was in danger, knew his most trusted warrior was fighting for her life, and he could do nothing. His pain, his rage, his desperation, it all flooded her, threatening to drown her. She squeezed her eyes shut, pushing back against the tidal wave. Stay strong. Stay strong for him. She focused her will, her love, her fierce determination into a single point of light and pushed it back along the bond, a desperate prayer into the storm. I am safe. Cale is strong. We are holding. Finish your fight and come home. Suddenly, a new sound cut through the chaos. The unmistakable, terrifying sound of an axe biting deep into the thick wood of the front door. They were trying to break it down. Chapter 33, Fire and Fury. The rhythmic, brutal thud of the axe against the front door was the sound of their time running out. Cale's rifle roared again, and a scream from outside told him he'd found his mark, but the chopping didn't stop. There were at least 2 of them left, and they were desperate. Lyah listened from the bedroom, her knuckles white where she gripped the rifle Cale had given her. The bond with Vince was a raw, open wound, a screaming agony of distance and helplessness. His fury was so immense it felt like it would tear her apart from the inside. It took every ounce of her will to remain calm, to keep from dissolving into a puddle of terror. She had to be his fortress, even as the walls of her own were being torn down. Suddenly, a new acrid smell seeped under the bedroom door. Smoke. Fire. Her blood ran cold. They weren't just trying to break in, they were trying to burn them out. A desperate, suicidal tactic. It meant they didn't care about taking her alive. Thorne's orders were likely to leave no witnesses. Luna. Cale's voice roared from the other room, tight with urgency. The tunnel. Now. The main room was filled with thick black smoke. Flames licked up the outside of the front door, the wood beginning to char and glow. Cale was a silhouette against the firelight, firing through a slit near the door, keeping the axeman at bay. Lyah didn't hesitate. She threw open the trapdoor. A wave of cool, damp air rushed up from the darkness below. She tossed the rifle down into the cellar, not wanting to be encumbered by it, and prepared to lower herself in. At that moment, with a final, splintering crash, a section of the front door gave way. A large, hulking figure, more wolf than man, snarled as it tried to force its way through the opening. Cale met him head-on, his rifle now useless at close range. He drew a massive hunting knife and slammed into the intruder, the 2 shifters locked in a brutal, primal struggle. Lyah watched in horror for a split second before another figure appeared in the broken doorway. A wiry, scarred shifter she recognized from Thorne's inner circle, Jax. He saw Cale occupied, and his cold, dead eyes scanned the smoky room and immediately locked on her. He saw the open trapdoor. He saw his prize. With a triumphant, cruel grin, Jax launched himself into the room, ignoring the fight. He was coming for her. There was no time to get to the tunnel. No time to escape. All the training, all the strength she had built, coalesced into a single blinding moment of pure, defiant rage. She was not a victim. She was not a prize to be taken. She was the Luna of Silverwood, and this was her home. As Jax lunged for her, she reached for the only weapon she had. On a small table by the bed stood the battery-powered lantern Cale had lit. Without thinking, she grabbed it, and as Jax's hands reached for her, she swung it with all her might, smashing the hot glass and metal against the side of his head. He roared in pain and surprise, stumbling back, a gash on his temple. But it was what happened next that changed the fight. The lantern fluid, a type of flammable oil, sloshed from the broken casing and splashed across his chest and arm. And in the firelit, oxygen-starved room, a single stray ember from the hearth, stirred by the sudden movement, drifted through the air. It landed on Jax's oil-soaked shirt. He erupted in flames. A terrifying human torch. His screams were inhuman, a shriek of pure agony and terror as he flailed wildly, beating at the flames that were consuming him. The distraction was all Cale needed. He shoved his opponent backward into the burning doorway and drove his knife home. Then he turned, his face grim, and saw Jax burning. Without a word, he grabbed the heavy bearskin rug from the floor and threw it over the screaming, flaming shifter, smothering the fire and the life out of him in one swift, brutal motion. The cabin was suddenly deathly quiet, save for the crackling of the fire at the door and the ragged sound of their own breathing. Cale stood over the 2 bodies, breathing heavily. Lyah stood frozen, the broken lantern still in her hand, staring at the smoldering, still form on the floor. She had just killed a man. And she felt no remorse. Only a cold, hard, and terrifying satisfaction. Chapter 34. The Alpha's Return. The fire at the door was small and hadn't yet taken hold of the main structure. Cale, moving with an economy born of long practice, used a fire extinguisher from the kitchen to put it out, plunging the room into a near-total darkness filled with smoke and the stench of death and burnt chemicals. He found another lantern and lit it, the steady, clean light pushing back the shadows. He looked at the 2 dead shifters on the floor, then at Lyah. She was pale, her face smudged with soot, but her eyes held a new, hard light. She hadn't screamed, hadn't panicked. She had fought. The tunnel, he said, his voice a low rasp. We still have to go. There may be more. Lyah nodded, her mind still reeling but her body obeying. She led the way into the cramped bedroom and down the ladder into the pitch-black root cellar. Cale followed, pulling the heavy trapdoor shut behind them. He found a latch on the underside and bolted it. They were entombed in darkness and silence. Give me a minute, Cale said, his voice strained. She heard him slump against a wall. You're hurt, she stated, moving toward the sound of his breathing. He got me in the side, he admitted. It's not deep. Lyah's eyes were adjusting to the gloom. She could make out his shape now, saw the dark stains spreading on his shirt. Without hesitation, she ripped a long strip of fabric from the hem of her own shirt. Let me see. In the close, silent darkness of the cellar, she tended to his wound, her hands surprisingly steady as she pressed the makeshift bandage against the gash in his ribs. A strange intimacy formed between them, the bond of soldiers who had survived a battle together. He had protected her with his life and she, in her own way, had done the same for him. They waited. Every minute stretched into an eternity. Above them they heard nothing. The silence was more unnerving than the sounds of the fight. And then through the bond Lyah felt it. A cataclysmic shift. The distant, agonizing helplessness that had been pouring from Vince was gone, replaced by a wave of pure, unrestrained alpha fury that was so close, so powerful, it was a physical force. It wasn't an echo anymore. It was a roar. He's here, she whispered, her voice filled with awe and a terrible savage joy. A moment later they heard it above them. A sound that was not a footstep but a heavy, powerful landing, as if something massive had leaped onto the porch. Then came a sound that would haunt Lyah's dreams for years. The splintering of wood and the tearing of flesh, followed by a choked, wet scream that was cut off abruptly. Cale scrambled to his feet, unbolting the trapdoor. Stay here, he commanded, but Lyah was right behind him as he climbed back into the bedroom. The scene in the main room was one of primal carnage. The last of Thorne's trackers, the one who had been outside, was dead on the floor, his throat torn out. And standing over him, his chest heaving, his clothes torn and blood-spattered, was Vince. He wasn't entirely human. His eyes were blazing gold, his features subtly elongated, his hands tipped with thick black claws. A low, guttural growl rumbled in his chest. This was the beast she had only glimpsed, unleashed in all its terrifying glory. He was covered in the blood and grime of his own battles, and his scent, pine, sandalwood and fresh blood, filled the room. His burning gaze swept the room, taking in the dead shifters, the broken door, the signs of the siege. Then his eyes found her. The beast receded. The claws retracted, the golden fire in his eyes softened to a molten glow, and the growl died in his throat. He was just Vince again, but a Vince who had been pushed to the very edge of his control. Lyah, he breathed, her name a prayer of agonizing relief. He crossed the room in 2 long strides, ignoring Cale, ignoring the bodies. He pulled her into his arms, crushing her against him, his face burying in the crook of her neck as he inhaled her scent, assuring himself she was real, she was alive, she was safe. His entire body trembled with the violent aftermath of his fear and his rage. Lyah wrapped her arms around him, clinging to him, her face pressed against his chest. She could feel the wild, frantic beating of his heart, the raw power thrumming through his body. The bond between them exploded with his presence. A tidal wave of relief, of love, of ferocious, absolute possession. He had come. He had kept his promise. The king had returned to his keep, to his queen, and he had brought hell with him. Chapter 35. The Spoils of War. Vince held her for a long time, his arms banded around her like steel, his breathing slowly returning to normal. He was grounding himself in her scent, in the solid, living warmth of her in his arms. The feral, primal rage that had driven him on a frantic day-long run through the forest was finally receding, soothed by her presence. He finally pulled back, his hands framing her face, his thumbs gently wiping the soot from her cheeks. His gaze was a physical touch, sweeping over her, checking for any injury, any sign of harm. His eyes lingered on the hard new light he saw in hers, and then on the broken lantern on the floor, and the smoldering corpse of the shifter Cale had covered. He looked at Cale, who gave a slight, grim nod of confirmation. A look of fierce, savage pride dawned on Vince's face. "You fought," he said, his voice a low, wondering growl. "She saved my life, Alpha," Cale stated from behind them, his voice rough with pain and respect. Vince's gaze returned to Lyah, and the love and pride in his eyes was so potent it made her feel weak. He leaned down and kissed her, not with the desperate passion of their claiming or the hungry branding of his departure, but with a deep, soul-shaking reverence. It was a kiss that acknowledged her strength, her courage. It was the kiss of an alpha for his equal. He finally turned his attention to Cale. "You're wound. It will heal," Cale said stoically. Vince's gaze swept the room again, the strategist re-emerging from the haze of emotion. "Thorne knows about this place now. He knows about her. This keep is no longer safe." He looked at the bodies of the trackers. This was an act of desperation. An assassination attempt. He wouldn't send his best trackers unless he was trying to cripple me before the real battle begins. His mind was already moving, calculating, planning his countermove. "Cal, you'll take the tunnel. Get to the secondary safe house. Get patched up and wait for my signal. I'm taking Lyah to Silverwood." The name of the town, the heart of the pack, hung in the air. It was a place of relative safety, a fortress filled with his warriors. But it was also a statement. He was done hiding her. He was done keeping his mate a secret. He was taking her home not to hide her away but to present her to their people. He was officially bringing his Luna to the heart of their kingdom. "Vince, is that wise?" Cale questioned, his brow furrowed with concern. "To bring her into the center of things now? It's the only move," Vince countered, his voice hard with certainty. "Thorne tried to take my queen. I'm going to put her on the throne, right in the center of my power, and show him and everyone else that our pack is not broken. We are stronger than ever." He looked at Lyah, a silent question in his eyes. "Are you ready for this?" She met his gaze without flinching. The thought of facing an entire pack of shifters, of stepping into the formal role of Luna, was daunting. But the thought of leaving his side again was unbearable. She had survived fire and assassins. She could survive a little pack politics. She gave him a firm, determined nod. Vince walked over to the body of Jax, the wiry, scarred shifter Lyah had set on fire. He knelt and, with a grim purpose, retrieved the man's knife from its sheath. It was a unique, cruel-looking blade. "A message for Thorne," Vince growled. He turned to the other bodies, repeating the action, collecting a grim trophy from each. The spoils of their victory. He stood, the knives in his hand. "Let's go," he said, his hand finding hers, their fingers lacing together. "It's time to go home." They left the keep with its smoke and its dead, and stepped out into the clean, cool night air. Vince led her to where he had left the truck, hidden deep in the woods. As they drove away, leaving Cale to his own escape, Lyah looked back at the dark, silent cabin. She had entered it as a frightened human, a piece of cargo to be protected. She was leaving it as a warrior, a survivor, a queen who had defended her first castle. The war was far from over, but the first battle had been won. And she had drawn blood. Of course. Here are the final 5 chapters of the story, bringing it to a dramatic and satisfying conclusion. Chapter 36. The Road to Silverwood. The drive to Silverwood was a journey from the harsh, violent edges of the territory to its warm, beating heart. As they descended from the rugged mountains, the landscape softened into rolling hills and meadows bathed in the silver light of a full moon. The primal, untamed energy of the wilderness gave way to a deeper, more resonant thrum, the collective presence of the pack. Lyah could feel it through the bond, a vast network of life and loyalty, all connected to the man beside her. It was like feeling the warmth of a great fire long before you saw the flames. This was his home. This was his family. Vince drove in a focused silence, the grim trophies, the knives of Thorne's dead trackers, wrapped in a cloth on the seat between them. The adrenaline from the fight had faded, leaving behind a deep, bone-weary exhaustion in Lyah. Yet she couldn't sleep. Her mind was racing, her senses alive. She felt as though she were on the verge of the most important moment of her life. "They will be afraid of you," Vince said, breaking the silence. His words startled her. "What? Why?" "You are human," he stated, as if it were the simplest fact in the world. "To many, our bond will seem unnatural. They will not understand it. They will see you as a weakness, a vulnerability in their alpha. And they will have heard about the attack on the keep. They will blame you for bringing the danger." His bluntness was a cold splash of water. She had been so focused on her own fear of meeting them that she hadn't considered their fear of her. But the mark, she said, her hand instinctively going to her neck. Kale said it would tell them. It tells them you are mine, Vince corrected gently, his thumb stroking the back of her hand. It commands their respect, but it does not command their trust. That is something you will have to earn. He turned to look at her, his golden eyes serious in the dim light of the cab. Do not be afraid of them, Lyah. Look them in the eye. Do not let them see you falter. You're my mate. You are their Luna. You are stronger than any of them know. Show them the queen I see. His faith in her was a shield. He wasn't just preparing her for a challenge, he was arming her for it. He believed in her, and his belief was becoming her own. Soon lights appeared in the valley below, nestled in a crescent shape along a bend in a wide, moonlit river. It was Silverwood. It wasn't a modern town, but a sprawling settlement of large, sturdy log and stone buildings, their roofs steeply pitched. Smoke curled from stone chimneys, and the warm, golden light of fires and lanterns spilled from the windows. It looked ancient, timeless, and deeply welcoming. As they drove down the main road, figures began to emerge from the buildings. They were drawn by the sound of the truck, by the scent of their returning alpha. They stood in silence on their porches and along the road, their faces a mixture of relief, curiosity, and suspicion. Lyah saw men and women, their builds powerful and athletic. She saw elders with wise, weathered faces, and children who peeked from behind their parents' legs, their eyes wide and luminous in the darkness. Vince pulled the truck to a stop in front of the largest building in the settlement, a great longhouse with a carved wolf's head over the massive double doors. The Pack Alpha's hall. He cut the engine, and a profound silence fell over the town. Every eye was on the truck. Every eye was on her. This was it. Vince got out, and a collective murmur of relief went through the crowd. Their alpha was home. But he didn't address them. He walked around to her side and opened the door, offering her his hand. It was a formal, public gesture. He was presenting her. Lyah took a deep breath, Vince's words echoing in her mind. Show them the queen I see. She took his hand and stepped out of the truck into the heart of the Silverwood pack. She lifted her chin and met the sea of watching, waiting, judging eyes. She did not falter. Chapter 37, The Queen's Gambit. The moment Lyah stepped into the moonlight, a palpable wave of shock and disbelief rolled through the assembled pack. She could feel it, a physical pressure of hundreds of confused, suspicious minds all focused on her. She heard the whispers, the low growls of uncertainty. Human. The word was a poison dart shot from dozens of mouths. Her scar, stark and silver in the moonlight, drew their eyes. They saw her fragility, her otherness. Vince's hand tightened on hers, a silent, unyielding support. He led her toward the steps of the great hall, the crowd parting before them like the sea. As they reached the steps, a formidable-looking woman stepped forward to block their path. She was tall, with a long braid of silver hair and eyes as sharp and gray as a winter sky. She was an elder, and she radiated an aura of authority that was second only to Vince's. Alpha, she said, her voice clear and strong, respectfully challenging. You were gone and war came to our doorstep. You return with this. Her gaze swept over Lyah, and there was no warmth in it, only a cold, hard assessment. A human female. Scarred. Scented like a city. This is the cause of our trouble? This is the weakness Thorne is exploiting. The accusation struck Lyah harder than any physical blow. You are the cause. You are the weakness. The old voices of self-doubt and fear screamed in her head. Before Vince could unleash the furious, protective snarl that was building in his chest, Lyah gently squeezed his hand, a silent signal. Let me. She let go of his hand and took a step forward, facing the elder alone. The entire pack held its breath. My name is Lyah, she said, her voice clear and steady, carrying in the silence. She met the elder's hard gaze without flinching. You are right. I am human. And yes, my presence brought Thorne's assassins to our door. She turned, addressing the entire pack, her voice ringing with a strength she didn't know she possessed. They came to the keep where your alpha had placed me for safety. They came to kill me, to take a weapon to use against him, against all of you. She paused, letting the weight of her words sink in. Then she held up her hands, showing them the small cuts and burns from her fight with Jax. They did not succeed. I did not hide. I did not cower. With your brave warrior, Kale, I defended your alpha's keep. We fought them and we killed them. She then walked to the truck, her movements deliberate and confident. She reached in and retrieved the cloth-wrapped bundle Vince had placed on the seat. She walked back to the steps of the hall and unfurled it. The 4 cruel, unique knives of Thorne's elite trackers clattered onto the wooden steps, gleaming in the moonlight. A collective gasp went through the crowd. These were not the blades of common thugs. They were the signature weapons of known, feared assassins. Trophies. Lyah looked back at the elder, her eyes blazing. I am not a weakness. I am the woman your alpha has chosen. I am the reason 4 of our enemies are dead tonight. I will not be the cause of this pack's fall. I will be the reason it stands. I am not your enemy. I am your Luna. A stunned, absolute silence descended upon the clearing. Lyah had not pleaded for their acceptance. She had not justified her existence. She had met their suspicion with facts, their fear with courage. She had laid the spoils of her own battle at their feet and claimed her title not by right of the Alpha's choice, but by her own actions. The silver-haired elder stared at her, her expression unreadable. Then slowly she bent down and picked up one of the knives. She examined it, then looked at Lyah, and for the first time, a flicker of profound respect entered her eyes. He turned to the pack. She speaks the truth, the elder declared, her voice booming. These are the blades of Thorne's reavers. To kill one is a great victory. To kill 4 is a sign. She looked at Lyah and then, in a gesture that shocked the entire pack, she bowed her head. Hail Lyah, Luna of Silverwood. A moment of stunned silence, and then one voice, then another, then a chorus took up the cry. It grew into a roar, a wave of acceptance and respect that washed over Lyah, healing old wounds she didn't even know were still bleeding. Vince watched, his chest swelling with a pride so fierce it was almost painful. She had not just earned their trust. She had conquered them. Chapter 38, The War Council. Inside the great hall, the air was thick with the smell of wood smoke, roasted meats, and the tense electric energy of a pack preparing for war. The senior members of the pack, the lead enforcers, the elders, the den mothers, gathered around a massive rough-hewn table, a map of the territory spread across its surface. Lyah sat at Vince's right hand, not behind him or beside him, but in a chair equal to his own at the head of the table. No one questioned her presence. Her gambit outside had earned her a seat. She remained silent, a watchful, observant presence, absorbing the flow of information, learning the faces and names of the people who were the pillars of Vince's pack. Vince, with Liam's confession and the trophies from the dead trackers, laid out the full scope of Thorne's plan. He detailed the numbers, the trap at the pass, the planned pincer movement. As he spoke, grim understanding and cold fury settled on the faces around the table. He intends to break us, Ulrich, the grizzled warrior from the northern outpost, growled. To slaughter our families while our warriors are pinned down. It is a coward's plan, the silver-haired elder, whose name Lyah learned was Alara, stated with contempt. And it will fail. Liam's treachery has given us an advantage, Vince said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. Thorne believes my vanguard will walk blindly into his trap at the main pass. He does not know that we know. We will use his own plan against him. For the next hour they planned. Vince was no longer just a primal force of nature. He was a brilliant, calculating general. He listened to his counsel, respected the wisdom of his elders, and valued the reports from his enforcers. But his strategy when he finally laid it out was one of audacious, breathtaking risk. Thorne wants a pincer movement? We'll give him one, Vince declared, his finger tracing lines on the map. Ulrich, you will take half our warriors, the fastest and the quietest, and you will go through the old wolf trails high in the mountains. You will bypass the main pass completely and come down behind Thorne's main force. You will be my hammer. He then looked to his lead enforcer, a powerful silent shifter named Ronan. Ronan, you will take the other half. You will march to the main pass as expected. You will be my anvil. You will engage Thorne's front line, draw them in, make them believe they have us trapped. You will hold them no matter the cost until the hammer falls. A tense silence filled the hall. It was a classic brutal strategy. But it left one glaring, terrifying vulnerability. It was Alara who voiced it. And Silverwood? Our homes, our children. This plan leaves us all but undefended. If Thorne has a third force, if even a small raiding party gets through. He won't, Vince said with cold certainty. How can you be sure? Ronan challenged, his loyalty unquestioned but his concern for the pack's heart evident. Vince didn't answer. He looked at Lyah. And she knew with a sudden chilling insight what the final piece of his plan was. The piece he hadn't yet shared. Later that night in the Alpha's private chambers, a large Spartan room dominated by a massive stone hearth and a bed covered in thick furs, Vince finally told her the rest. Thorne thinks he's hunting me, Vince said, his back to her as he stared into the fire. But he's not. He's hunting what he thinks is my weakness. He turned to face her, his golden eyes blazing with a fire that was both terrifying and utterly devoted. I am not going with Ulrich. And I am not going with Ronan. I am going to give Thorne exactly what he wants. I am going to let him find me. Lyah's blood ran cold. What are you talking about? A duel. No. A hunt, Vince corrected. While my army crushes his, I am going to lead Thorne himself and his personal guard on a chase. Away from the main battle. Away from Silverwood. I will be the bait. I will draw the head of the snake away from its body. And then when he is alone deep in my territory, I will turn the hunt around. It was the ultimate Alpha's gambit. He was making himself the target to protect his people. He was risking everything, not just on his army but on his own strength, his own ability to outwit and outfight his bitterest enemy. You'll be alone, she whispered, the words catching in her throat. No, he said, closing the distance between them. He took her hands in his. I will have you. Your strength will be my shield. Your courage my sword. Through the bond she felt the absolute unwavering truth of his words. He was not just flattering her, he was stating a tactical fact. She was a vital part of his plan, his anchor in the coming storm. He pulled her into his arms, his embrace a promise of both a battle and a homecoming. This was the final night before the war. Chapter 39. The Anvil and the Hammer. The morning of the battle dawned cold and gray, the sky a sheet of pewter. The air in Silverwood was thick with a heavy, prayerful silence. Lyah stood on the porch of the great hall, Vince at her side as the pack's warriors assembled in the main square. They were a formidable sight. Over 200 shifters, men and women clad in dark, practical leathers, armed with a mixture of modern rifles and the traditional blades of their people. Their faces were grim, resolute. There was no fear, only a cold, hard determination. Vince addressed them, his voice ringing with the Alpha's command. He didn't give them a speech of soaring rhetoric. He spoke of their homes, their children, their land. He spoke of the poison of betrayal and the duty to cleanse it. When he was done, he raised a single clenched fist in the air. A unified, guttural roar answered him, a sound that shook the very foundations of the valley. Lyah watched as Ulrich led his warriors away first, melting into the high mountain trails like gray ghosts. Then Ronan and his force marched out, their path taking them directly toward the fatal pass. The anvil and the hammer were in motion. When they were gone, an eerie quiet settled over the town. Vince turned to Lyah. The time for their own departure was here. There were no grand farewells. He simply cupped her face in his hands, his gaze locking with hers. Alaire will watch over you. Stay within the hall. I will not be far. You will feel it when it begins. Be my fortress, Lyah. Through the bond she felt his love, his resolve and the fierce, wild joy of the coming hunt. She pushed back her own fear, sending him only strength, only love. I am with you, always. He gave her one last hard kiss, a brand of promise on her lips, and then he was gone, melting into the woods not as a man but as a shadow. Lyah spent the next hours in the great hall with Alaire and the other women and children. They were not idle. They prepared bandages, sharpened reserve weapons and organized supplies. There was no panic, only a powerful collective resolve. They were the heart of the pack and they would be ready for their warrior's return. Late in the afternoon Lyah felt it. A sudden violent explosion of rage and fury on the bond. It was Ronan's force. The battle had begun. She closed her eyes, her hands gripping the arms of the great wooden chair she sat in. She could feel the clash of bodies, the roars of rage and pain, the desperate, unyielding courage of the anvil as it held against the crushing force of Thorne's army. An hour later, another surge, this one from a different direction. A triumphant, savage joy. Ulrich's hammer had fallen. She could feel the shock and confusion of Thorne's forces as they were attacked from behind, their perfect trap turned into a slaughterhouse. And then a third sharp, intensely personal spike of pure adrenaline and killing intent. Vince. His own hunt had begun. She felt him running, the wind in his hair, the earth flying beneath his feet. She felt Thorne's rage, his frustration as he was drawn away from the main battle. She felt the chase, the deadly cat-and-mouse game being played in the ancient woods. She was the anchor point for all of it. Her consciousness was split, a silent witness to 3 different fronts of the same war. She sat on the Alpha's throne, her face pale, her knuckles white, but her spirit was a rock. She was Vince's fortress, and her walls would not crumble. The battle raged for what felt like an eternity. Lyah felt losses, sharp, sudden pangs of grief as pack members fell. But she also felt the overwhelming rising tide of victory. The anvil was holding. The hammer was crushing. And the king was leading his enemy to the slaughter. Chapter 40. A Kingdom of Two. The final confrontation happened in a place of ancient power. A ring of standing stones on a bald, windswept hill. Lyah felt it all through the bond as if she were there. She felt Vince, no longer the prey, turn on his pursuers. She witnessed the swift, brutal efficiency with which he dispatched Thorne's personal guard, using the forest he knew as his greatest weapon. And then there were 2. Vince and Thorne. Alpha against Alpha. The fight was not a clash of armies, but a deeply personal, hate-fueled duel. It was savage, primal, a whirlwind of shifting forms of tooth and claw and blade. Lyah felt every blow Vince took, every surge of pain and exhaustion. But she also felt his unbending will, his superior strength, his absolute certainty of purpose. He was not just fighting for his life or his title. He was fighting for his home, for his pack, for his mate. The end came with a final desperate lunge from Thorne and a swift, decisive counter from Vince. A wave of grim, final satisfaction washed over the bond, and then, a profound, echoing silence. It was over. Lyah didn't know how long she sat there, adrift in the calm aftermath, before the first sounds of the returning warriors reached the town. She stood, her legs unsteady, and walked out onto the porch of the great hall. They came limping from the woods, the victorious survivors of the hammer and the anvil. They were bloodied, battered, and weary to the bone, but they walked with their heads held high. They had lost friends, brothers and sisters, but they had saved their home. The pack gathered in the square, a somber, respectful silence falling as they waited. They waited for their king. He appeared at the edge of the forest as the sun began to set, staining the gray sky with streaks of crimson and gold. He was alone. He was covered in blood, both his and his enemies'. He walked with a slight limp, and his face was a mask of exhaustion, but his eyes, when they found Lyah across the square, were blazing with a triumphant golden light. He carried nothing in his hands. He didn't need a trophy. His victory was in his stride, in the survival of his people. Lyah didn't wait. She ran from the porch across the square, her feet flying over the packed earth. She didn't slow until she launched herself into his arms, burying her face in his chest, her tears finally falling, washing away the blood and the soot. He wrapped his arms around her, holding her so tightly she could barely breathe, and it was the safest she had ever felt. The entire pack watched as their alpha held his human mate, his Luna, his queen. They saw not a weakness but the source of his incredible strength. They saw the end of their war and the beginning of their future. A single howl rose from the crowd, from Lyah, a sound of victory, of grief, and of profound, hopeful joy. It was answered by every wolf in Silverwood, a chorus that echoed off the mountains and washed over the valley, cleansing the land of the last vestiges of betrayal and fear. Later that night, curled together in the furs of the alpha's bed, the great hall quiet save for the crackling of the fire, Lyah traced the new scar on Vince's shoulder. Her own scar on her face no longer felt like a brand of pain, but simply a part of her story. A story that had impossibly led her here. "It's really over," she whispered. "For now," Vince rumbled, his voice a deep, contented sound. "There will always be challenges. But we will face them together." He pulled her closer, his lips finding hers in the firelight. "You walked into the wrong room, Lyah." "Did I?" she murmured against his mouth, a smile in her voice. "No," he growled, his wolf and his man finally perfectly in balance. "You walked into your home. You walked into your destiny." He sealed his words with a kiss, and in the heart of their wild, beautiful kingdom, the alpha and his queen were finally at peace, their 2 souls united, their reign just beginning. Think,